Jake Morrison's weathered hands froze mid-reach for the tranquilizer gun, his breath catching as the massive Lioness let out another agonized roar that echoed across the Masai Mara. 48 hours of labor, and Amara was dying. This wasn't just any birth. The cubs were breached, and without immediate intervention, he'd lose them all. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell stumbled backward, her medical bag crashing to the ground as instruments scattered across the red earth. Behind them, 72-year-old Ethel Mae Thompson clutched her chest, gasping words that made Jake's blood run cold. Those bulldozers, they're only 2 miles out. The storm clouds gathering overhead seemed nothing compared to the memory that suddenly gripped Jake. 15 years ago, these same golden eyes had watched him make the worst mistake of his life. Amara's father, the rifle, the terrible accident that changed everything. "We've got 6 hours before that storm hits," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "And Vincent's men won't wait." What Jake did next would either redeem a lifetime of guilt or destroy the last hope for forgiveness he'd ever have. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days earlier, the morning sun had painted the Masai Mara in shades of gold that reminded Jake Morrison why he'd never left Kenya. At 38, the former Marine had traded his combat boots for safari guides, but the ghosts of his past still haunted every sunrise. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his battered Land Rover as he navigated the familiar dirt roads, the converted shipping container he called home growing smaller in his rearview mirror. "Every sunrise is a second chance," he muttered to himself, a mantra that had kept him sane for 15 years. But some mistakes, Jake knew, cast shadows too long for any dawn to erase. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped off the small charter plane at the Masai Mara airstrip, her Detroit Tigers baseball cap askew and her veterinary bag clutched tight against her chest. At 45, she carried herself like someone who'd been holding her breath for too long. The recent divorce papers were still fresh in her jacket pocket, along with the bankruptcy notice for her clinic. $200,000 in student debt had finally caught up with her dreams of healing animals. "I fix broken hearts in animals because I can't fix my own," she'd told her sister before boarding the plane to Kenya. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was running away to save creatures when she couldn't save her own marriage or practice. Vincent Cross emerged from a luxury safari vehicle like a man accustomed to owning whatever he surveyed. The 52-year-old California developer wore khaki that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and his smile never quite reached his calculating eyes. He'd promised Sarah $500,000 for her veterinary consultation on his wildlife conservation project. What he hadn't mentioned was the $50 million in debt hanging over his head like a sword, or his wife's ultimatum. Make this Kenya deal work or lose everything. Ethel Mae Thompson hobbled off the tour bus with the practiced shuffle of a woman who'd learned that looking helpless made people underestimate you. At 72, the supposed widow from Texas clutched a worn photo of her late husband and spoke in honeyed drawl about bucket list adventures. Her simple clothes and careful spending painted the picture of someone stretching a modest pension to afford one last dream. What none of them suspected was that Ethel Mae Thompson was worth more than all their combined assets, or that she had exactly 30 days left to live. The terminal brain cancer diagnosis sat hidden beneath her silver curls, along with the satellite phone that could summon help from her $500 million conservation foundation with a single call. As fate drew these 4 unlikely souls together in the shadow of acacia trees, none of them could imagine how a dying lioness would force them to confront the deepest truths about loyalty, redemption, and the price of second chances. Vincent Cross arrived at the makeshift camp like a man bearing gifts, his pristine Land Cruiser gleaming against the dusty backdrop of the Masai Mara. The back of his vehicle was loaded with expensive veterinary equipment that made Sarah's eyes widen with professional longing. Portable ultrasound machines, surgical suites, anesthesia equipment worth more than her entire Detroit clinic had been. "Dr. Mitchell, I presume?" Vincent's handshake was firm, practiced, the grip of a man who closed deals with confidence. "I can't tell you how excited I am about our partnership. This equipment is just the beginning of what my foundation can provide for wildlife conservation in Kenya." Sarah ran her fingers over the pristine surgical instruments, her heart racing with possibilities. With equipment like this, she could save animals that would otherwise suffer or die. The bankruptcy papers in her pocket suddenly felt less heavy. "This is incredible, Mr. Cross." "I've never seen field equipment this advanced." Ethel May Thompson shuffled closer, her weathered hands clasped behind her back as she examined the machinery with what appeared to be simple curiosity. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled. That's some fancy doctoring equipment. Must have cost a pretty penny." Her fingers brushed against Vincent's briefcase as she steadied herself, and in that brief moment she photographed the visible documents with a camera disguised as a simple hearing aid battery. Jake Morrison hung back, his instincts prickling like an animal sensing a predator. Something about Vincent's too-perfect setup didn't sit right. The man asked too many questions about land values, animal populations, migration patterns, questions that had nothing to do with veterinary care and everything to do with development potential. "So tell me, Jake," Vincent said, consulting an expensive tablet, "how many lions would you estimate call this particular area home?" "I want to ensure our conservation efforts are comprehensive." "Depends on the season," Jake replied carefully. "Migration patterns shift. Why do you need exact numbers?" Vincent's smile never wavered. "Statistical analysis, donor reports. You understand." The conversation was interrupted by Jake's radio crackling to life. "Jake, you need to get out to Sector 7 immediately," came the voice of his Maasai tracker, Samuel. "We've got a situation with the Kamana Pride." 20 minutes later, the small group stood at the edge of a rocky outcropping, watching a scene that made Sarah's veterinarian heart race. Below them, a heavily pregnant lioness paced restlessly near a small cave opening, her golden coat dusty and her movements labored. She was alone, separated from her pride, and clearly in distress. "That's unusual," Jake murmured, lowering his binoculars. "Lionesses usually stay with the pride when they're ready to give birth." Something spooked her. Sarah's trained eye took in the lioness's condition immediately. "She's carrying twins, maybe triplets. Look at the size of her, and see how she's favoring her left side. This could be a difficult birth." Ethel May gripped her simple walking stick, her eyes bright with interest. Bless her heart, she looked scared. "Where's her family?" "That's what worries me," Jake said grimly. He pointed to a spot several hundred yards away where flies buzzed around something large and dark. "Found her mate yesterday. Bullet wound." Vincent stepped forward, his expression suddenly serious. "Bullet wound? That's terrible. Poachers?" "Could be," Jake replied, though something in Vincent's tone made him study the man's face more carefully. "Or trophy hunters. Been seeing more of both lately." Sarah knelt to examine tracks in the soft earth, her experienced eye reading the story written in paw prints and disturbed soil. "She's been here for at least 2 days. Probably started early labor. If she doesn't deliver soon." She trailed off, the implications clear to everyone. Vincent consulted his tablet again, swiping through what appeared to be maps and survey data. "This is exactly why we need to consider relocation programs. Pregnant animals, isolated and vulnerable. It's not safe for them or for the tourists who come to see them." "Relocation?" Jake's voice carried a sharp edge. "Where exactly would you relocate them to?" "Sanctuaries, protected areas, places where they can't threaten human safety or... Vincent caught himself, his businessman's mask slipping for just a moment. Where they can receive proper veterinary care. Ethel May had been listening with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating people's true intentions. Her simple phone, which was anything but simple, was recording every word Vincent spoke. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, sugar. Must cost a fortune to move big cats around." As if summoned by their conversation, the lioness below let out a low, mournful sound that echoed off the rocks. It was a sound of pain, of loneliness, of a mother's desperate need for her missing mate and absent pride. Sarah stood, brushing dust from her knees. "I need to examine her. With the right equipment, I might be able to help." Vincent's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that seemed genuine but felt calculated. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Dr. Mitchell. This could be the perfect opportunity to document our conservation efforts." Jake watched Vincent's face carefully, noting how the man's gaze kept drifting to his tablet, to the survey markers barely visible in the distance, to everything except the suffering animal below them. The first contractions began at 3 in the morning, piercing the African night with sounds that made Jake Morrison's blood run cold. He'd been dozing fitfully in his sleeping bag when Amara's agonized roars echoed across the Masai Mara, primal and desperate. By the time he reached the rocky outcropping with his flashlight, Sarah was already there, her veterinary bag spread open like a field hospital. "How long has she been like this?" Sarah whispered, crouching low to avoid spooking the laboring lioness. "Started about an hour ago," Jake replied, his voice tight with concern. "But something's wrong. I've seen dozens of births out here. And this?" He gestured helplessly at Amara, who was lying on her side, panting heavily between contractions that seemed to accomplish nothing. Sarah's trained eye took in the lioness's condition with growing alarm. The animal's distended belly suggested multiple cubs, but her positioning indicated a breached birth. In the wild, that was often a death sentence. "The cubs are positioned wrong. Without intervention, we're going to lose them all." Ethel May Thompson had insisted on coming despite her age, claiming she wouldn't miss this miracle for all the tea in China. Now she sat on a nearby rock, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching the scene with an intensity that seemed odd for a simple tourist. "Poor sweet thing," she murmured. "Been through this myself, honey. Sometimes the little ones just don't want to come into this harsh world." Vincent Cross arrived with his expensive camera equipment, ostensibly to document the birth for his Conservation Foundation's records. But Jake noticed how Vincent kept glancing at his watch, consulting his tablet, making quiet phone calls in what sounded like Afrikaans. When pressed about the calls, Vincent dismissed them as coordinating with the helicopter pilot for emergency evacuation if needed. "We need to tranquilize the male first," Sarah said, indicating the massive lion pacing anxiously near the cave entrance. Django was clearly agitated by his mate's distress, his golden mane bristling with each protective growl. "I can't get close enough to help her with him standing guard." Jake's hands began to shake as he reached for the tranquilizer rifle. The familiar weight of the weapon brought back memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The crosshairs of a scope, a magnificent mane filling his vision. The terrible moment when he'd grabbed the wrong rifle during a training exercise and taken a life instead of preserving one. "Jake?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. "Jake, are you okay?" He stood frozen, the tranquilizer gun heavy in his grip, watching Django pace protectively around his laboring mate. The male lion's amber eyes caught the flashlight beam, and for a heart-stopping moment Jake could swear he saw recognition there. Impossible, of course. The lion he'd killed 15 years ago was dead and buried. But lions lived in prides, had families, passed down territories through generations. "I can't," Jake whispered, lowering the rifle. I can't do it. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. What do you mean you can't? You're the most experienced guide in Kenya. You've tranquilized hundreds of animals. Not lions, Jake said quietly. Never lions. Not anymore. Vincent stepped forward, his expression shifting from concern to calculation. Perhaps we should call in professional hunters. I have contacts who specialize in dangerous animal situations. They could be here by morning. Ethel May's sharp eyes caught the subtle change in Vincent's demeanor, the way his fingers moved to his phone with practiced ease. Now hold on there, sugar. That seems mighty extreme for helping a mama in labor. The conversation was interrupted by Amara's most agonized cry yet, a sound that seemed to tear through the night air. Sarah rushed to the edge of the rocks, using her flashlight to examine the lioness from a safe distance. What she saw made her stomach drop. She's been in active labor for too long. The cubs are in distress. If we don't intervene in the next few hours, they'll die. Sarah turned to face the group, her medical training warring with the reality of their situation. And there's something else? I think she might be hemorrhaging internally. Jake felt the weight of his past crushing down on him like a physical force. Here was a chance for redemption, an opportunity to save the life he'd once taken away. But his hands continued to shake, his finger refusing to move toward the trigger of even a tranquilizer gun. Ethel May stood slowly, her weathered frame straightening with surprising dignity. Jake Morrison, I don't know what demons got hold of you, but that mama down there doesn't have time for your personal troubles. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sometimes we got to face our worst fears to do what's right. As if responding to her words, Ethel May suddenly clutched her chest, her face contorting in apparent pain. She swayed dangerously, her breath coming in short gasps. "Oh, Lord," she whispered. I think I'm having a heart attack." Sarah immediately shifted into medical mode, rushing to Ethel's side as the older woman collapsed onto the rocky ground. Her pulse was rapid and irregular, her skin pale and clammy. "We need to get her to a hospital immediately," Sarah said, looking frantically between the dying lioness and the apparently dying woman. Vincent stepped forward with practiced concern. "My helicopter can be here in 30 minutes. We'll evacuate Ethel while you handle the animal situation, Doctor." Mitchell. But Jake's suspicious nature was finally overriding his paralysis. Something about the timing felt wrong. Ethel's collapse was too convenient, Vincent's solution too ready. And there was something in the older woman's eyes that didn't match her apparent medical distress. "Wait," Jake said, kneeling beside Ethel. Her grip on his wrist was surprisingly strong for someone having a heart attack, and when she squeezed 3 times in rapid succession, he recognized it as an old military signal for danger close. Ethel May Thompson whispered so quietly that only Jake could hear. "Trust your instincts, honey child. That man ain't what he seems. And this old bird's got more tricks than you know." Jake Morrison made his decision in the space between heartbeats. Ethel's whispered warning echoed in his mind as he forced his trembling hands to steady around the tranquilizer rifle. 15 years of guilt would have to wait. Amara and her cubs were dying. And whatever game Vincent was playing, Jake wouldn't let innocent lives be lost again. "I'm going in," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his Marine training. Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Ethel, torn between her human patient and the laboring lioness below. The older woman gave Jake an almost imperceptible nod, her heart attack symptoms mysteriously stabilizing just enough for her to wave Sarah toward the more urgent case. "Go help that mama, sugar," Ethel whispered to Sarah. "This old ticker's been acting up for years, but those babies don't get a second chance." The tranquilizer dart caught Django in the shoulder as he paced near the cave entrance. The massive male lion stumbled, his protective instincts warring with the sedative coursing through his system. As he collapsed into unconsciousness, Jake felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. The same helplessness he'd experienced 15 years ago when he'd held a different weapon, made a different choice. Sarah rappelled down the rocky face with equipment that Vincent had provided, her veterinary bag secured to her back. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using the would-be destroyer's tools to save life. As she approached Amara, the lioness's golden eyes tracked her movement with exhausted awareness, as if recognizing that help had finally arrived. "Easy, beautiful," Sarah murmured, her voice taking on the gentle cadence she used with all her patience. "I'm here to help you and your babies." Vincent watched the rescue attempt through expensive binoculars, his tablet showing GPS coordinates and survey maps that had nothing to do with veterinary care. Every few minutes he made quiet phone calls in Afrikaans, his tone growing increasingly urgent. When Jake managed to overhear fragments, clearing schedule, equipment positioning, no witnesses, his military instincts screamed danger. Ethel Mae Thompson's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Within minutes of Sarah descending to help Amara, the elderly woman was sitting upright, her color returned and her breathing normal. But her eyes never left Vincent, and her simple phone was positioned to record every call he made. "Mighty strange how modern medicine works," she said conversationally to Vincent. "One minute you're dying, next minute you're fit as a fiddle. Kind of like how one day a man's a conservationist, next day he's something else entirely." Vincent's mask slipped for just a moment, his calculating gaze sharpening as he studied Ethel's sudden recovery. "Amazing recovery indeed, Mrs. Thompson." Almost too good to be true. Below them, Sarah worked with the focused intensity of someone fighting death itself. Amara's contractions were growing weaker, her breathing more labored. The first cub appeared in the wrong position, its tiny form limp and unresponsive. Sarah's hands, trained by years of emergency veterinary medicine, worked to clear the cub's airway while simultaneously repositioning it for delivery. "Come on, little one," she whispered, performing CPR on the tiny lion with 2 fingers. After what felt like an eternity, the cub gasped, its weak cry echoing off the cave walls. Jake's radio crackled to life with Samuel's voice. "Boss, you need to know. There are vehicles moving toward your position. Big ones. Construction equipment." The timing was impossible to ignore. Vincent checked his watch and smiled with satisfaction. "Right on schedule," he muttered, apparently forgetting that others could hear him. "Schedule for what?" Jake demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward the sidearm he still carried from his military days. Vincent's composure finally cracked completely. "The development schedule, of course. My investors have been very patient, but $50 million requires results. This land has been surveyed, approved, and purchased. Construction begins whether there are lions here or not." Ethel Mae's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Well, sugar, that's where you're wrong on several counts. First, this land belongs to the Kenyan Wildlife Service, not your shell company. Second, those surveys were conducted without proper permits. And third," she stood with surprising grace, her frail act disappearing entirely, "you're about to discover that some conservation foundations have teeth." The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but they weren't coming from the direction Vincent expected. Instead of his private evacuation aircraft, official Kenyan Wildlife Service helicopters appeared on the horizon, their markings clearly visible in the growing dawn light. "How did you—" Vincent began, his face pale with realization. "Call for backup?" Ethel Mae smiled, holding up what he'd assumed was a simple flip phone. "Honey child, I've been in communications with the authorities since the moment you started talking about relocating dangerous animals. Turns out, when you're worth $500 million and dying of brain cancer, you don't have patience for liars and animal killers." Sarah's voice carried up from the cave, tight with strain. "The second cub is breached. I need more time." Vincent's desperation peaked as the sound of his own bulldozers mixed with the official helicopters. His entire empire was crumbling, but he still had one card to play. "Dr. Mitchell," he called down to Sarah. "You have 30 seconds to get clear of that animal before my equipment operators arrive. They have orders to clear this area by any means necessary." Jake's military training kicked in completely. He'd failed to save a lion's life 15 years ago, but he wouldn't fail today. "Like hell they do," he growled, moving to position himself between Vincent and the cave entrance. The confrontation was interrupted by an extraordinary sound. Django's protective roar as the male lion fought off the tranquilizer's effects through sheer force of will. The massive cat struggled to his feet, still groggy but driven by an instinct more powerful than any sedative, the need to protect his family. Vincent pulled a pistol from his jacket, his businessman's facade completely abandoned. "This ends now. Too much money is at stake, and too many people know too much." But as he raised the weapon, something unprecedented happened. Amara, despite her exhaustion from labor, despite the pain and blood loss, crawled from the cave entrance and positioned herself between Vincent and the humans who had risked everything to save her cubs. The lioness, who should have been focused only on her newborns, chose instead to protect the people who had shown her kindness. Jake stared in amazement. In 15 years of working with wild animals, he'd never seen anything like it. Predators didn't protect humans from other humans. They didn't make conscious choices to repay kindness with loyalty, yet here was Amara, a wild lioness who had every reason to fear humans, using her own body as a shield. Ethel May's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Cross, I suggest you reconsider your options. Those helicopters carry Kenyan authorities with full arrest warrants. Your construction crew is about to be detained for operating without permits on protected land. And that gun you're holding, well, that just upgraded your charges from fraud to armed assault." The sound of the second cub's first cry echoed from the cave, weak but alive. Sarah's relieved sob carried up to them, followed by her shaky voice. "They're both breathing! Twins, both alive!" Vincent's hand shook as he kept the pistol trained on the group, his empire collapsing around him, but his desperation making him dangerous. "You don't understand. I'm 50 million in debt. My wife, my company, everything depends on this deal. I can't go back with nothing." Jake met Vincent's eyes with the steady gaze of a man who'd found his redemption. "Some things are worth more than money, Vincent, and some debts can only be paid with honor, not cash." As the official helicopters began to land and uniformed officers emerged, Amara slowly turned her head toward Jake. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the lioness looked directly into the eyes of the man who had once taken a life from her family and chose forgiveness over vengeance. The moment Vincent Cross raised his pistol higher, everything erupted into chaos. Jake Morrison lunged forward, his Marine training overriding 15 years of civilian life. But Vincent had already made his choice. The gunshot cracked across the Masai Mara like thunder, and for a heartbeat that lasted forever, everyone froze. But it wasn't Jake who had been shot. Django, still fighting the effects of the tranquilizer, had positioned himself between Vincent and the cave entrance where his mate and newborns lay vulnerable. The bullet caught the massive male lion in the shoulder, spinning him around as he roared in pain and fury. Blood splattered across the red earth as Django stumbled but remained standing, his amber eyes now locked on Vincent with primal hatred. "You bastard!" Jake's voice carried a rage that 15 years of guilt had been building toward. He tackled Vincent around the waist, sending them both crashing to the rocky ground as the pistols skittered away. "That's enough! No more killing!" Sarah's scream echoed from the cave below. "The cubs! Amara's trying to move them." The lioness, despite her exhaustion from birth, was attempting to carry her newborns deeper into the cave, away from the violence above. But her strength was failing, and one of the cubs had fallen from her mouth, its tiny body motionless on the cave floor. Ethel Mae Thompson moved with surprising speed for a 72-year-old woman, snatching up Vincent's dropped weapon before he could recover from Jake's tackle. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," she said, her voice deadly calm. 40 years I've been cleaning up messes made by men like you, but this is the first time I've had to hold a gun on one." Vincent struggled beneath Jake's weight, his businessman's composure completely shattered. "You don't understand. I'm 50 million in debt. My wife will leave me. My company will collapse. Everything I've worked for will be gone." "Good," Jake growled, pressing Vincent's face into the dirt. "Maybe you'll finally understand what it feels like to lose everything because of your own choices." The sound of approaching helicopters grew deafening as Kenyan Wildlife Service aircraft circled overhead, but they couldn't land safely with an active shooter situation in progress. Below them, Django was bleeding heavily from his shoulder wound, his strength ebbing as he tried to maintain his protective stance over his family. Sarah's medical training kicked into overdrive as she watched the scene unfold from the cave. The male lion was losing too much blood. Amara was in shock from the trauma of birth and violence, and one of the cubs wasn't breathing. "Jake!" she called desperately. "I need to get up there. Django's going to bleed out." But as she started to climb toward the rocky ledge, Vincent broke free from Jake's grip with a surge of desperate strength. The developer scrambled toward where Ethel held his pistol, his face twisted with the madness of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "Give me the gun, old woman," Vincent snarled. "I'll finish what I started. No witnesses, no evidence, no problems." Ethel Mae's expression hardened into something that reminded everyone present that she hadn't built a $500 million empire by being anyone's victim. "Sugar," she said quietly. "I've stared down boardrooms full of men like you. I've buried a husband, outlived 3 of my children, and been told I have 30 days to live. You think I'm scared of some 2-bit developer with more debt than sense?" Vincent lunged for the weapon, but what happened next would be seared into Jake's memory forever. Amara, the lioness who had just given birth, who should have been focused entirely on her cubs, hauled herself out of the cave entrance. Despite her exhaustion, despite the blood loss, despite every instinct that should have told her to hide with her newborns, she threw herself between Vincent and the elderly woman who had shown her nothing but kindness. The impact sent Vincent sprawling backward toward the edge of the rocky outcropping. For a moment he teetered on the brink, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain his balance. His eyes met Jake's across the distance, and in that instant, Vincent Cross looked less like a ruthless developer and more like a terrified man who had finally realized the consequences of his choices. "Help me," Vincent whispered. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward him, 15 years of Marine training demanding that he save a life, even an enemy's life. But as he reached forward, Django collapsed, the blood loss finally overwhelming the massive lion's strength. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed across the savannah like a death knell. Vincent's scream as he fell seemed to go on forever, echoing off the rocks as his body disappeared into the ravine below. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the sound of helicopters landing and Sarah's desperate sobs from the cave. "The cub," she called, her voice breaking. "I can't get it to breathe. I can't save it." Jake found himself frozen again, watching Django's labored breathing as the male lion struggled to stay conscious. Here was the moment he'd been avoiding for 15 years. Another lion dying because of violence, another chance to save a life slipping away. But this time, he had the skills to help. This time, he could choose redemption over paralysis. "Ethel, call for a medical evacuation for Django," Jake commanded, his voice steady for the first time in days. "Tell them we need a veterinary surgical team immediately." Already on it, honey child, Ethel replied, speaking rapidly into her satellite phone in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Jake rappelled down to the cave where Sarah was still working frantically over the motionless cub. Her hands were covered in blood, whether from the birth or from trying to revive the tiny lion, he couldn't tell. "How long has it been?" he asked. 3 minutes without breathing, Sarah gasped, continuing chest compressions on the cub with 2 fingers. "Jake, I don't think it's going to make it." Above them, Amara watched with the stoic acceptance of a wild animal who understood that not all cubs survive, but her golden eyes never left the humans who were fighting so desperately to save her baby. Django, despite his injury and blood loss, crawled to the edge of the cave entrance, adding his presence to what felt like a vigil. "Don't give up," Jake said quietly, his hands joining Sarah's in the resuscitation effort. 15 years ago, I took a life I shouldn't have taken. Today, we save every life we can." The cub's tiny chest suddenly expanded with a shuddering breath, then another. The sound of its weak cry mixed with Sarah's sob of relief and Jake's whispered prayer of gratitude. When the cub opened its eyes for the first time, it looked directly at Jake Morrison, and he felt something break loose in his chest that had been frozen there for 15 years. Kenyan Wildlife Service officers were rappelling down to secure the scene when Amara did something that would later be studied by animal behaviorists around the world. She gently picked up each of her cubs and placed them at Jake's feet, then lay down beside them in a gesture of complete trust. A wild lioness, who had every reason to fear humans, was entrusting her newborns to the very species that had brought violence into her world. "Sweet Lord in heaven," Ethel May whispered from above, "that mama's choosing to trust the folks who saved her babies over her own wild instincts." The veterinary team that arrived via helicopter worked for 2 hours to stabilize Django's shoulder wound. Throughout the surgery, Amara never left Jake's side. Her cubs nestled against his legs as if he were part of their pride. When the veterinarians confirmed that Django would survive, the male lion's first act upon waking was to approach Jake Morrison and touch his massive paw to the man's outstretched hand. It was forgiveness in its purest form, wild, unearned, and completely transformative. Sarah watched through tears as Jake finally found the peace that had eluded him for 15 years. "I came here to save animals," she whispered. "Turns out they were saving us." From the bottom of the ravine, search and rescue teams confirmed what everyone already knew. Vincent Cross had not survived the fall. His $50 million debt would die with him, along with his plans to destroy one of Kenya's most precious ecosystems. As the sun reached its zenith over the Masai Mara, casting everything in golden light, Ethel May Thompson looked down at the unlikely family that had formed around tragedy and redemption. A former Marine carrying guilt, a bankrupt veterinarian seeking purpose, a dying billionaire looking for meaning, and a lion family that had chosen to trust the species that had nearly destroyed them. "Sometimes," she said to nobody in particular, "the good Lord works in ways that would make a saint scratch his head in wonder." The celebration of new life and Vincent Cross's defeat lasted exactly 14 hours before everything Jake Morrison had fought to protect began unraveling like a rope under too much strain. He woke before dawn to the sound of diesel engines rumbling across the Masai Mara, their mechanical growl a stark contrast to the natural symphony of the African wilderness. "Jake, you need to see this." Sarah's voice carried a tremor of disbelief as she stood at the edge of their temporary camp, binoculars trained on the eastern horizon. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold, a convoy of construction vehicles stretching across the savannah like an army of metal predators, their yellow paint gleaming in the early morning light. Vincent Cross was dead, but his legacy of destruction lived on through corporate contracts and legal obligations that extended far beyond one man's life. The lead contractor, a granite-faced Afrikaner named Peter van der Merwe, emerged from the lead bulldozer with papers that looked official enough to level half of Kenya. "Gentlemen, ladies," van der Merwe announced in accented English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This operation proceeds as scheduled. Mr. Cross's unfortunate accident doesn't void our construction contracts or our deadlines." Ethel May Thompson studied the documents with the sharp eye of someone who had spent decades navigating corporate legal systems. What she saw made her face pale beneath her weathered tan. "These contracts have backup clauses," she whispered to Jake. "If the primary developer dies or defaults, the project automatically transfers to the construction company. They own the development rights now." The irony was crushing. Vincent's death, which had seemed like salvation for the wildlife preserve, had actually triggered a legal mechanism that made the destruction inevitable. Van der Merwe's company had invested too much in equipment and planning to walk away empty-handed, and Kenyan bureaucracy moved too slowly to stop a project that was technically legal. Sarah felt her heart breaking as she watched Amara nursing her cubs in the cave below, unaware that their sanctuary was about to become a construction zone. "How long do we have?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. 48 hours, van der Merwe replied, with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a weather forecast. Environmental impact studies are waived for projects under 50 acres. Safety protocols require all wildlife to be relocated or eliminated before heavy machinery operations begin. Jake's military training had taught him to recognize no-win scenarios, but this felt different. This felt personal. "There has to be something we can do. Legal challenges, injunctions, something." Van der Merwe's laugh was as cold as a Johannesburg winter. "Mr. Morrison, I've been building in Africa for 30 years. I've seen every trick, every delay tactic, every bleeding heart attempt to stop progress. This project moves forward, whether you like it or not." The construction foreman's radio crackled with updates from his crew leaders. The bulldozers were positioning themselves in a perfect grid pattern, ready to begin systematic destruction of everything that made this corner of the Masai Mara special. Their timing was calculated and ruthless. They would start on the far side of the preserve and work their way toward Amara's cave, giving the lions nowhere to retreat. Ethel May made a series of increasingly desperate phone calls, her satellite phone connecting her to lawyers, government officials, and conservation organizations around the world. But bureaucracy was a slow-moving beast, and van der Merwe's operation was designed to present the world with a fait accompli before anyone could organize effective resistance. "My foundation can file for an emergency injunction," Ethel said, her voice tight with frustration. "But it'll take at least 72 hours to process through Kenyan courts. By then, this place will be a parking lot." The sound of the first trees falling echoed across the savannah like gunshots, each crash representing decades of growth reduced to splinters in seconds. Sarah watched through binoculars as a centuries-old baobab tree, thick enough to house a small family, toppled under the blade of a bulldozer operated by someone who probably saw it as nothing more than an obstacle to his paycheck. Jake's radio buzzed with reports from Samuel and other local guides. The noise and vibration of the heavy machinery was scattering wildlife for miles in every direction. Elephant herds were abandoning traditional migration routes. Antelope were fleeing toward areas that couldn't support their numbers, and the delicate ecosystem that had taken millennia to develop was being shattered in hours. "We could try to relocate Amara and her cubs," Sarah suggested, though her veterinary training told her how dangerous it would be to move newborns. "There's a protected area about 50 miles south." "You want to put 2-day-old cubs in a truck and drive them across rough terrain for hours?" Jake's voice carried all the pain of someone watching his chance at redemption slip away. "Even if they survived the journey, Amara would never trust humans again. We'd be destroying everything we've built with her." The lioness in question seemed to sense the approaching danger. From her cave, Amara watched the distant destruction with the alert stillness of a predator, recognizing a threat beyond her ability to fight. Her cubs, still blind and helpless, mewed softly against her belly, unaware that their world was shrinking by the hour. Vander Merwe approached their camp with an offer that felt like salt in an open wound. "I'll give you 12 hours to capture your lions and move them elsewhere. After that, they become a safety hazard that my men will have to eliminate." The construction foreman's casual mention of killing Amara and her cubs sent Jake into a rage that took all his self-control to contain. "You're talking about murdering a mother and her babies." "I'm talking about workplace safety," Vander Merwe replied coldly. "My insurance doesn't cover lion attacks, and I won't risk my men's lives for a bunch of cats." Ethel May's phone rang with news that crushed their last hope. Her lawyers in Nairobi had discovered that Vincent Cross's company had purchased not just development rights, but also hunting permits for dangerous wildlife management. The construction company could legally kill any animals they deemed threatening, and a lioness with cubs would definitely qualify. As the sun reached its zenith, painting the destruction in harsh, unforgiving light, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm staying," she announced quietly. "If they want to kill Amara and her cubs, they'll have to go through me first." Jake looked at the woman who had traveled halfway around the world to escape her problems, only to find something worth dying for. "Sarah, you can't—" "Yes, I can," she interrupted, her voice steady with newfound purpose. "I've spent my whole life running away from things that mattered. My marriage, my practice, my dreams. I'm not running anymore." Ethel May smiled with the pride of someone recognizing true courage. "Well, sugar, if you're planning to make a stand, you won't be doing it alone. This old bird's got a few tricks left." The sound of approaching bulldozers grew louder as Vander Merwe's deadline expired. In 12 hours, the machines would reach Amara's cave, and everything Jake Morrison had worked to protect would be reduced to rubble and memory. But as the three humans prepared to face impossible odds, none of them noticed Amara doing something unprecedented in the wild. She was moving her cubs toward them, not away. The lioness had made her own choice about whom to trust when the world turned hostile. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a simple phone call that changed everything Jake Morrison thought he knew about the woman who had been sharing their camp. Ethel May Thompson's satellite phone buzzed at precisely 6:47 a.m., and when she answered with "Thompson Conservation Foundation CEO speaking," her entire identity shifted like sand in the wind. Jake and Sarah stared in stunned silence as the elderly woman they'd known as a simple tourist from Texas began rattling off legal terms and financial figures that made their heads spin. Within minutes, she was coordinating with international lawyers, Kenyan government officials, and conservation organizations across 3 continents. "Ma'am, with respect," Vander Merwe interrupted, having overheard the conversation. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. My contracts are ironclad, and this operation proceeds as scheduled." Ethel May's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Well, sugar, that's where you're about to learn something interesting about corporate law and conservation easements." She held up a tablet that had materialized from her supposedly simple luggage, its screen displaying legal documents that made Vander Merwe's confident expression falter. "Vincent Cross didn't own this land," Ethel continued, her voice taking on the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom battles. "He leased development rights from a shell company called Serengeti Holdings. What Mr. Cross didn't know, and what you apparently didn't verify, is that Serengeti Holdings has been a subsidiary of the Thompson Conservation Foundation for the past 3 years. The construction foreman's face went through several colors as the implications sank in. "That's impossible. We did title searches, legal reviews. You did searches on properties Vincent thought he owned." Ethel interrupted. But Vincent was always better at making money than understanding where it came from. When his company needed capital injection 2 years ago, they sold their land holdings to raise cash. They just never bothered to read the fine print about who was buying. Sarah felt like she was watching a magic trick being performed in reverse, seeing how the illusion was constructed instead of just witnessing the final effect. "You've been planning this for years," she said, awe creeping into her voice. "Honey child, I've been fighting men like Vincent Cross since before you were born," Ethel replied. "The difference is, I learned to use their own greed against them. Vincent needed money fast, so he sold land rights to the highest bidder without checking who that bidder actually was." Vandermeerwe's radio crackled with increasingly frantic calls from his crew leaders. Kenyan Wildlife Service helicopters were landing around the construction site, and uniformed officers were ordering work to cease immediately. The legal machinery that Ethel had set in motion was moving with the efficiency of a system designed for exactly this moment. "This is corporate terrorism," Vandermeerwe snarled, his professional composure finally cracking. "You've destroyed legitimate business operations, cost hundreds of jobs." "I've saved one of the most important ecosystems in Africa," Ethel corrected calmly. "Your legitimate business was based on fraudulent land claims and illegal development permits. Every tree you cut down, every animal you displaced, was criminal activity masquerading as commerce." Jake found his voice after several minutes of stunned silence. "Why didn't you tell us? Why the act?" Ethel May's expression softened, revealing glimpses of the woman who had comforted him through his breakdown. "Because I needed to know what kind of people you really were. Money changes how folks behave, Jake. When people know you're worth $500 million, they start telling you what they think you want to hear instead of what they really believe." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She had tested them all, their character, their commitment, their willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. And somehow, they had passed. "Besides," Ethel continued with a sly grin, "watching Vincent Cross try to con a billionaire into funding his own destruction was more entertaining than cable television." Sarah laughed, despite everything, a sound that held equal parts relief and disbelief. "So, Vincent never had a chance? This whole thing was orchestrated?" "Not orchestrated, sugar. Anticipated." Ethel's voice grew serious. "Men like Vincent are predictable. Give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves while trying to lasso the moon. I just made sure there was a soft landing for the innocent bystanders." Vandermeerwe made one last desperate attempt to salvage his operation. "My company has already invested millions in equipment and preparation. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Ethel interrupted, consulting her tablet. "Your contracts were with Cross Development, which is now in bankruptcy due to its owner's death and the revelation of his fraudulent business practices. The Thompson Conservation Foundation is prepared to offer your company fair compensation for equipment already transported, plus a generous bonus for immediate withdrawal from the area." The offer she displayed on her screen was apparently generous enough to make Vandermeerwe's financial objections evaporate. Within an hour, the convoy of destruction was rumbling away from the Masai Mara, leaving behind only tire tracks and a few traumatized trees. As the dust settled, literally and figuratively, Jake found himself sitting beside Amara's cave, watching the lioness nurse her cubs in peace. The sound of construction had been replaced by the natural symphony of the African wilderness, but the emotional whiplash of the morning had left him feeling drained. "I still don't understand," he said when Ethel joined him on the rocky outcrop. "If you owned the land all along, why let things get so close to disaster? Why put Amara and her cubs through that stress?" Ethel May was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap, as she watched the lion family below. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades and the knowledge of mortality. Because real conservation isn't just about protecting animals from developers, honey child. It's about protecting them from people who claim to love them but don't understand the cost of that love. She gestured toward the cave where Amara lay contentedly. That mama down there chose to trust you not because you had money or power or legal documents, but because you risked everything to save her babies when you didn't have to. The depth of her strategy became clear as Jake processed her words. The test hadn't just been about stopping Vincent Cross. It had been about finding people who would protect wildlife for the right reasons, even when it seemed hopeless. The Foundation needs people like you and Sarah, Ethel continued. Folks who'll stand between bulldozers and baby animals without checking their bank account first. Money can buy land, but it can't buy the kind of commitment you showed when you thought we were going to lose everything. Sarah emerged from the cave where she'd been checking on the cubs, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done. Both cubs are thriving, she reported. Amara's milk production is excellent, and they're gaining weight beautifully. And Django? Jake asked, referring to the male lion who was recovering from his gunshot wound in a temporary enclosure nearby. Healing faster than I expected, Sarah replied. The bullet missed all major arteries and infection risk is minimal. He should be back to full strength within a month. Ethel May smiled with the contentment of someone whose plans had come together perfectly. So we've got a healthy lion family, 50,000 acres of protected land, and a conservation team that's already proven they'll fight impossible odds to protect what matters. As if responding to their conversation, Amara appeared at the cave entrance with one of her cubs gently held in her mouth. To everyone's amazement, she carried the tiny lion directly to Jake and placed it at his feet, then returned for the second cub and repeated the gesture. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Ethel whispered. "That mama's formally introducing you to her babies." The moment felt sacred, a wild animal acknowledging the debt she owed to the humans who had risked everything for her family. When Amara settled beside Jake with both cubs nestled against her side, it created an image that would later become the symbol of the Thompson Conservation Foundation, the bridge between human compassion and wild trust. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice soft with wonder. Ethel May's eyes twinkled with the mischief of someone who still had plenty of surprises left. "Now, sugar, we change how the world thinks about conservation. And we start with two little cubs who'll grow up knowing that some humans can be trusted." 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the same rocky outcropping where everything had changed, but the view below was transformed beyond recognition. Where once there had been a single lioness struggling to survive alone, now a thriving pride lounged in the afternoon shade of acacia trees that would never face a bulldozer's blade. Amara's cubs, no longer helpless newborns but playful juveniles with golden coats and bright, curious eyes, tumbled over each other in the grass, while their parents watched with the relaxed confidence of animals who knew they were safe. The transformation hadn't been limited to the lion family. The Thompson Conservation Foundation's Masai Mara Research Station had risen from the red earth like a testament to what was possible when unlimited resources met unlimited compassion. Solar panels gleamed on the roofs of buildings designed to blend seamlessly with the landscape, and the world's most advanced veterinary facilities hummed quietly beneath structures that looked more like luxury safari lodges than research laboratories. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the main veterinary building, her Detroit Tigers cap replaced by a practical wide-brimmed hat that had become her trademark across Kenya. At 46, she moved with the confidence of someone who had found their true calling after decades of searching. Her mobile clinic program now served remote communities across 3 countries, and her research on human-animal emotional bonds was revolutionizing conservation science around the world. The naming ceremony footage just hit 500 million views, she called to Jake, holding up her tablet with barely contained excitement. The New York Times wants to do a feature story, and National Geographic is offering us our own documentary series. Jake smiled, remembering the morning when Amara had done something unprecedented in the wild animal kingdom. The lioness had developed a specific behavior pattern that researchers were still struggling to fully understand. She would bring her cubs to Jake and Sarah repeatedly, touching each cub to a specific human in what could only be described as a formal introduction. When animal behaviorists confirmed that she was essentially naming her cubs after the humans who had saved them, the video had gone viral across every social media platform on the planet. The male cub, who had been the first to breathe after Sarah's desperate resuscitation efforts, was now known throughout the conservation world as Jakeson. His sister, who had been born healthy but whose survival had depended on Jake's protection during Vincent's final desperate act, carried the name Sarah May with the dignity of a lioness who seemed to understand her special significance. "Hard to believe it all started with a tranquilizer gun I was too scared to use," Jake mused, his weathered hands now steady as he adjusted the binoculars that had become essential equipment in his new role as head ranger of the preserve. The Marine, who had been paralyzed by guilt for 15 years, was now the leading expert on trauma recovery partnerships between humans and wild animals. Ethel May Thompson's voice carried across the compound with the authority of someone whose experimental cancer treatment had bought her not 30 days, but 2 additional years of vibrant life. "Jake Morrison, you get yourself over here. These documentary people want to hear about your revolutionary trust-building protocols." The elderly billionaire had become something of a celebrity in conservation circles, her story of using corporate cunning to protect wildlife, inspiring a new generation of activist philanthropists. The Thompson Conservation Foundation had grown from a $500 million organization to a $2 billion empire that protected over 50,000 acres of African wilderness, while providing sustainable employment for hundreds of local community members. But it was the smaller, more personal transformations that meant the most to Jake. Samuel, his Maasai tracker, now managed a team of 30 community rangers whose intimate knowledge of the land made them more effective than any technology. Local schools received funding and supplies from the foundation, and children who might once have seen wildlife as a source of conflict now grew up understanding animals as partners in their community's prosperity. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of the day's most important visitors. A convoy of official vehicles wound through the preserve's dusty roads, carrying delegates from 12 African nations who had come to study the Masai Mara model of conservation success. The program had become so effective that governments across the continent were requesting assistance in establishing similar partnerships between conservation foundations and local communities. Django appeared at the edge of the gathering, his shoulder fully healed and his magnificent mane fuller than ever. The male lion had developed an unusual routine of appearing whenever official visitors arrived, as if he understood his role as an ambassador for his species. The scar from Vincent's bullet was barely visible beneath his golden coat, but it served as a permanent reminder of how close they had all come to losing everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethel May addressed the international delegation with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades commanding boardrooms and conferences, "what you're about to witness represents a fundamental shift in how we approach wildlife conservation. Instead of building walls between humans and animals, we've built bridges." As if summoned by her words, Amara appeared with both cubs trailing behind her. The lioness had developed an uncanny ability to sense when important events were taking place, and her participation in educational programs had become legendary throughout the conservation community. She approached the viewing area with the calm confidence of an animal who had learned that humans could be partners rather than threats. The key insight, Sarah explained to the fascinated delegates, is that emotional bonds transcend species barriers when they're based on genuine need and authentic response. Amara didn't bond with us because we had food or territory to offer. She bonded with us because we risked our lives to save her cubs when she was powerless to save them herself. One of the delegates, a minister of wildlife from Tanzania, raised his hand with a question that went to the heart of the program's philosophy. Dr. Mitchell, how do you replicate emotional authenticity? How do you teach other conservation workers to form these bonds? Jake stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the transformation he was describing. You can't teach it, sir. You can only create the conditions where it becomes possible. When people are willing to put animal welfare above their own safety, above their own financial interests, above their own comfort, that's when real conservation happens. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when the most remarkable moment of the day occurred. Jakeson and Sarah May, now confident juveniles who had never known fear of humans, approached the group of visitors with the curious boldness of young lions raised in safety. But instead of simply investigating the strangers, they did something that made several delegates gasp in amazement. Each cub approached a specific human. Jakeson went directly to Jake, while Sarah May positioned herself beside Sarah and settled down in the classic lion resting pose. The message was unmistakable. These cubs understood their special relationship with their human namesakes, and they were demonstrating that understanding to the watching world. "Every time I witness this," whispered Dr. Amanda Roberts, the British ethologist who had spent months documenting the cubs' behavior, "I'm reminded that we're observing something that shouldn't be possible according to everything we know about wild animal behavior." Ethel May's phone buzzed with a message that brought tears to her eyes. Her oncologist in Houston was reporting that her latest scans showed continued remission, with treatment success rates that had defied every statistical prediction. The woman who had been given 30 days to live was not only surviving, but thriving. Her purpose-driven life, apparently providing healing that medicine alone couldn't achieve. As the delegation prepared to depart, each member committed to implementing aspects of the Masai Mara model in their own countries. The ripple effects of one lioness's choice to trust humans were spreading across an entire continent, changing how governments and communities thought about the relationship between development and conservation. That evening, as the African sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake found himself in his favorite spot overlooking Amara's territory. Sarah joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression of someone who had finally found her place in the world. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling beside him on the rocky ledge where their adventure had begun. Jake considered the question seriously, his gaze moving from the thriving lion pride below to the research station that hummed with purposeful activity to the conservation workers heading home after another day of protecting something precious. "About Detroit?" Sarah clarified. "About the life you left behind?" "I came here to heal broken animals because I couldn't heal myself," Sarah replied softly. "Turns out healing them was exactly what I needed to heal myself." In the distance, Amara's roar echoed across the savannah, a sound that had once represented loss and loneliness, but now spoke of family, protection, and the complex bonds that could form between species when fear was replaced by trust. Ethel May's voice drifted across the evening air as she concluded her daily call with Foundation headquarters in Texas. "Tomorrow's another day, honey child, and every sunrise is still a second chance." Jake smiled, remembering when those words had been desperate hope rather than simple truth. "Every sunrise," he agreed, Watching Jackson and Sarah May settle down for the night beside their parents is a second chance. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the four humans who had risked everything for two lion cubs sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the proof that sometimes the most unlikely families are the strongest ones of all. Sometimes the most profound moments of our lives come disguised as impossible choices. When Jake Morrison stood paralyzed by 15 years of guilt, unable to pull that tranquilizer trigger, he thought his chance at redemption had passed forever. How many of us carry similar burdens, mistakes we made decades ago that still whisper, "You're not worthy of a second chance"? But here's what Amara the Lioness taught us about forgiveness. It's not about deserving it, it's about accepting it when it's offered with an open heart. At 55, 60, or 68, we often believe our most meaningful chapters are behind us. We think about retirement, about slowing down, about becoming observers rather than participants. But Ethel Mae Thompson proved that some of life's greatest adventures begin after 70. Her terminal diagnosis became her liberation. Freed from the fear of consequences, she chose to spend her remaining time creating something beautiful and lasting. The cubs named Jackson and Sarah May didn't care about Jake's past mistakes or Sarah's failed marriage. They saw only the humans who fought impossible odds to save them. Maybe that's the secret to happiness in our golden years, learning to see ourselves through the eyes of those we've helped rather than the harsh judgment of our own regrets. What second chance are you afraid to take? What legacy do you want to leave behind? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.